guys, today we're going to talk about ankle sprains. We are coming to that time of year as volleyball wraps up and basketball starts where we see a lot of ankle sprains. We want to make sure we're treating them right. You may absolutely not just rest and go back to normal activity and pretend like an ankle sprain is not a big deal. An ankle sprain is a really, really big deal. And today we're going to talk about why. My foot and ankle are the best friends of my hip and pelvis. So for my hip to have good function, my foot and ankle have to have good function. For my foot and ankle to have good function, my hip has to have good function. These two things work together to make you an elite athlete. If one of them doesn't, A, you're not going to be as fast, you're not going to be as explosive, you're not going to be as awesome, and B, you are going to chronically be re-injured and it can turn into something extremely serious. So let's talk about how. An ankle sprain is typically, little floppy here. An ankle sprain typically happens on the outside of your ankle. So this is my left foot. As I step down, I roll and we see this joint shift and this joint shift. What happens then is we overstretch tissue, potentially tear some connective tissue or muscle, and we end up with a lot of swelling. Okay, so old traditional treatment was rest, ice, compress, and elevate, right? So we wanted to rest it because we're walking on it. You don't want too much impact through that injured body part. We wanted to ice it because we had swelling. We wanted to compress it because we want to move the swelling out of there as quickly as possible. And we want to elevate because our feet are always in effect of gravity. So we're always pulling fluid down as we stand, sit, walk. So elevating helps pull that out. So those are all great things. However, we cannot just rest for a week, turn around and go back to whatever sport or activity we're doing, because I need to make sure that this joint is functioning correctly. So the two biggest things that have to happen in an ankle is my shin bone or tibia has to be able to glide on my talus. Your talus is that super important bone that connects your leg to your foot. That talar joint, subtalar joint, is responsible for all shock absorption through your leg, and it helps you cut, and it helps you adapt to unlevel surfaces, and it helps you load to jump. So when we sprain an ankle, sometimes that talus can get tilted and it's not gliding well in the joint, or the inflammation in that joint and connective tissue can literally restrict your glide over that talus. That's going to cause you to absorb shock someplace else in the system. So your body's going to say, ow, this hurts. Oh, this doesn't move. I'm going to find the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance can be through my knee or through my hip. So if your foot and ankle doesn't move effectively, if it doesn't move appropriately, your body just finds another place to go. And what we don't want is that to translate into knee pain, like a patellar tendonitis, or feeding into an Osgood-Schlatters tendon overuse type situation, or hip pain, where my hip is trying to make up for the motion I can't absorb at my foot and ankle, and I end up with a labral tear in my hip or SI joint dysfunction or low back pain. So all of that can happen just from that little subtalar joint restriction, which happens in about 98% of ankle sprains. The other joint we have to be really, really aware of is my fibular glide, or my fib. Okay, so as my foot rolls in with that ankle sprain, my fib glides down. So for me to jump, land, squat, push off, my fibula has to glide up. In a bad enough ankle sprain, you can glide down and get stuck there. And if we lose this up and down glide, you lose a lot of foot in and out, okay? If I lose a lot of foot in and out, I lose a truckload of hip strength. It is this foot in and out glide, or this subtalar pronation, that turns on my butt. Your glute or your butt muscle is the single most important muscle in athletics. It is your power, it is your balance, it is your explosion, it is your push-off, it is your absorption for landing. You have to have a butt. And those athletes with the better butt are the better athletes. I cannot cut efficiently, I cannot turn on that butt efficiently if I can't pronate or glide at both my subtalar joint and my fibula. We see people with chronic and recurrent ankle sprains, and when they come into the clinic and they say, oh, I've had 2 or 3, it's no big deal, I have weak ankles. You don't have weak ankles. 90% of the time you have a restriction with that fibular glide that's limiting your ability to turn muscle on. So we have to have that motion. So with traditional ankle treatment, we lose it because the first thing we do is brace you. We absolutely do not want to brace your ankle unless we have to. So if I'm gonna wear an ankle brace for the first 1 or 2 weeks to go back to activity so that your body can feel a little more confident and stable as you're transitioning back, fabulous. To turn into a long-term brace wearer, absolutely not. You are asking for a knee or hip injury, and this is why. A brace compresses your ankle joint, and a brace limits the proper glide of tib and fib on your talus. Okay, so we talked about earlier, I have to have this proper glide to turn on my hip. So if you put a brace on me and you take that proper glide away, you take away good function of my hip. We also talked about swelling and tightness and restriction from the original injury will limit my ankle motion, okay? If you limit my ankle motion, your body tries to find more motion someplace else. Where is it going to find the motion? At your knee and at your hip. So I do not want to trash my knee, I do not want to trash my hip by putting an ankle brace on and asking those 2 joints to do more. So a brace's job is to protect you as you transition back, to give you confidence, to help you strengthen in a pain-free situation. But as you transition back to full activity and you move forward as an athlete, your job is to make sure that you have great ankle joint mobility at your tibia and talus, great ankle joint mobility with fibular glide, great strength and ability to adapt and move through mid-tarsal joint. All of this is flexible, not this flexible. But your foot is made up of all these bones and all this mobility so that you can adapt. When we have an injury and we have swelling and your body tightens up in response, we lose this adaptive ability. You oftentimes don't appreciate that because your knee or your hip is making up for the fact that you've lost motion here until 1 or 2 years, 4 years down the road, you end up with back pain, you end up with a labral tear in your hip, you end up with a meniscus tear in your knee because that chronic repetitive stress of other joints having to make up for the lack of motion in your ankle and the lack of proper glide as you squat, run, jump, push off, tears up the rest of your body. The other thing that's important to know is not only does mobility here help you feel better and help prevent injury, but it also makes you a superior athlete. The more efficient you are at this glide and this glide and this glide, the faster you can be, the more explosive you can be, and the more awesome you can be. So with an ankle sprain, I strongly encourage you to seek physical therapy and get that stuff checked out. Don't just rest it, don't just ice it, and don't just hope that it feels better and you can move on.